Well, good morning and good evening, everyone. Nice to be with you once again. This is our third session on the webinar series Theosophy, Raw and Unfiltered, the Vedas from the past to the present. And today we're going to be looking at the meaning of the word theosophy and some aspects of our work together in the Theosophical Society, based of course on some of the principles that we've been speaking about in the first two sessions. First of all, a very simple, straightforward question: what kind of a place is the Theosophical Society meant to be? Of course, we get asked that quite often by people coming along to our lodges and branches. They ask it more politely, but I'm asking it now, perhaps a little gruffly. What kind of a place is the Theosophical Society meant to be? So I've got three slightly different answers here. First of all, a very straightforward, non-controversial, factual one. Simply put, the Theosophical Society is a membership association for those who are interested in theosophy. A second level of meaning perhaps, or another, not exactly a definition, but another take on things. The TS is meant to be a place where people are introduced to theosophy and encouraged to develop themselves along those lines for the good of the whole. Now, this is not exactly anybody's definition, but I think it is fairly non-controversial, and many people in the Theosophical Society do feel that it is not just a question of learning a bit about theosophy, but also developing ourselves along those lines and for the good of the whole, not just for our own benefit, even though there is a great deal of personal benefit to be gained. And finally, for now, a slightly amended version of H.P. Blavatsky's take on what kind of a place is the Theosophical Society meant to be. The Theosophical Society is meant to assist in showing the world that such a thing as theosophy exists and inspire people to ascend towards it by studying and assimilating its eternal verities. Now, these are all quite non-controversial statements, especially if you don't look at them too closely. Actually, what HPB said in Key to Theosophy is slightly different to the way I've put it in the third statement there. She said that the society was formed to assist in showing to men that such a thing as theosophy exists, and to help them to ascend towards it by studying and assimilating its eternal verities. Now, there are two things in that statement which are non-controversial only if we don't think about their implications too closely. The first one is the word showing. What does it mean to show that such a thing as theosophy exists? The meaning of the word show in the sentence, in showing to men that such a thing as theosophy exists, has to first of all include delineating the subject matter, disclosing the object of knowledge. It might just be the finger pointing to the moon, but the finger does actually have to point to the moon. The finger effectively says, there is such a thing as moon, and moon over there. And I'm not sure that we do that too much in the Theosophical Society these days. So it is essential to first of all delineate the subject matter, disclose what the object of knowledge is supposed to be. How could it be otherwise? And then there is another word in that statement of HPB's that is not controversial, but only if you don't think about it too closely. And that's where she says, help them to ascend towards it by studying and assimilating its eternal verities. I'm not sure how much thought has been put lately into how should we help people ascend towards theosophy. The part where it says help them ascend. How do we help people ascend? We could perhaps just inspire them to ascend by, first of all, ascending ourselves. For example, you might get a fantastic mountain climber doing a beautiful climb, and then people looking on will say, wow, that was just gorgeous. I'd like to do that too. And so you might inspire people to ascend towards Theosophy by yourself ascending towards it. But I think this is something else. The statement here says, help them, not just inspire them. And I think it would be very good if a number of people in the Theosophical Society got together and worked out an actual plan. How do you help people to ascend towards Theosophy? I was once given an example, which I would like to share with you, as they say, of when Rolls-Royce decided to create the best engine in the world, the first Rolls-Royce engine. When they made that decision, there was no Rolls-Royce engine. There were just common, ordinary garden variety engines, perhaps. But a group of people got together and said that we are going to create the best conceivable engine. Now, before creating the best conceivable engine, they had to sit down and work out the steps that it would take, how much money it would take, what kind of research, how many research hours. Whereas in the Theosophical Society, we have our objects and we have this injunction to help people to ascend towards Theosophy, but we don't really have a plan on how to do that. Maybe there's a knack to it. Maybe there's a way of structuring our meetings and presenting things to people that is more likely than less likely to end up resulting in a number of people making the trek to ascend to Theosophy rather than just sitting around listening to lectures about it. But first of all, the word show. How can we possibly show the world, or men or women, that Theosophy exists without defining it? This slide is called The Importance of Delineating a Subject Matter. The importance of delineating our subject matter should not be underestimated. There is this wonderful statement in a 5th century, I think, linguistic textbook on linguistics from India called Vakyapadiya, which means words in a sentence. It's what words in a sentence have meaning and how do they have meaning. It's to do with creating meaning and understanding. And it says in that text, in this world, there can be no knowledge without an object to be known. Now that seems like a very basic, non-controversial statement. In this world, there can be no knowledge without an object to be known. In terms of Theosophy and the Theosophical Society, however, it's not quite so uncontroversial, because what it means is, in this world, in the Theosophical Society, there can be no knowledge of Theosophy without clearly defining what is the object to be known. Without an object to be known, clearly specified, we can never get to any knowledge about it. It's important, therefore, that we continue to distinguish the proper object of knowledge from all of the background noise. Otherwise, we cannot even begin to ascend the Himalaya to knowledge and to wisdom. And I don't know what it's like in the various places that people are viewing this webinar from, but in my experience in the Theosophical Society, many of our programs are given over to what I would regard as rather peripheral matters and not very clearly defined subject area of Theosophy. And so that people coming along as inquirers to the Theosophical Society don't necessarily get the kind of background and sort of specific knowledge about Theosophy that I'm trying to present in this webinar, and which no doubt many other people have presented in other webinars, particularly Pablo Sender, of course. But without distinguishing the proper object of knowledge from all the background noise, we cannot even begin. So, in my opinion, our reluctance to define Theosophy in the Theosophical Society, or to provide a working definition of it, has done us a great disservice. because, to repeat, in this world there can be no knowledge of Theosophy without a clear idea of the object to be known. So we begin by clearly defining what we mean by the term and some other terms, outlining the subject area, pointing to the subject area, and then we begin to explore, to delve, to question, and to assimilate. And we don't need to make up these definitions or decide all for ourselves what the subject matter, the subject area is. It's all been done for us in the past, in the very ancient past and in the not so ancient past. It's not just a matter of personal opinion what Theosophy is. If we define Theosophy based just on our personal opinion, then we are not going to get very far. It's not going to be authentic. There is in fact an authentic tradition, and I believe that that is the best and healthiest and securest starting point for all of us in the TS. Ed says it sounds like a destination. Well, in some ways it is a destination, and let's just see what the destination is. Who gets to say what is the starting point if we're trying to come to an understanding, a mutual agreement, a definition of Theosophy? Who gets to say what is that starting point, that delineated subject matter? This is a wonderful quote from N. Sri Ram, the 5th President of the Theosophical Society, from a talk that he gave to the Australian Convention in about 1971. And he says, "A person can find out what Theosophy is, partly from the thoughts and writings which have come down from ancient times, partly by studying the modern theosophical works of H. P. Blavatsky, Annie Besant and others, and partly by his or her own earnest meditations and inquiry." To me, that is a perfectly well-rounded roadmap. And partly, not wholly one or the other. I don't think it can be wholly based on our own meditations and inquiry without some kind of a background knowledge, some kind of a starting point that is not just based on our own understanding. And partly, I really do feel that it does need to be based on the thoughts and writings which have come down to us from ancient times, and we've been looking a little bit at the Rig Veda, which is the most ancient writings that we have before us, and also partly by studying the modern theosophical works of H. P. Blavatsky, Annie Besant and others. So as said in the first session, not entirely studying the second generation authors in the TS, but also going back to their primary source, which was H. P. Blavatsky, and not just studying H. P. Blavatsky, but also going back to her primary source, the Mahatma letters, the Rig Veda, the Upanishads, the Kabbalah, so many other primary sources for Theosophy. So I thought that was very worthwhile putting to people. A person can find out what Theosophy is, and this doesn't just mean us finding out. I think this also means this is what we should be presenting regularly in the Theosophical Society. Theosophy as it has come down to us from the thoughts and writings of ancient times, the works of H. P. Blavatsky, Annie Besant and other writers in the Theosophical Society, and our own earnest meditations and inquiry. Pretty good, well-rounded roadmap there, I feel. Now, we have a fear of dogma in the Theosophical Society, which has been a little crippling. So now I would like to take a look at what the word dogma does and does not mean, and what implications the word dogma does and does not have for us in the Theosophical Society, where we say, quite rightly, that there is no dogma or teaching beholden on the members of the Theosophical Society. This is not a dogmatic society, it is an inquiry-based society. But let us see now what the word dogma really means. The word dogma comes to us from the Greek doxa, meaning belief, opinion, and appearance. The word appearance there might have already put up a flag for some people who were at the first session, because appearance is Maya. So the word dogma comes to us from the Greek doxa, belief, opinion, appearance, and Latin docere, to teach. From these words we derive in English the words doctrine, a system of taught beliefs, orthodox, accepting prescribed beliefs. We also get heterodox, which is rejecting prescribed beliefs. Doctor, one who is qualified to teach. So that is someone with a PhD, not a general practitioner or a medical doctor. Doctor, one who is qualified to teach. Document, a recorded teaching. Disciple, one who is committed to being trained and taught. And discipline, a rigorous system of training. We also get from the root words belief, opinion, appearance, the root word meaning belief, opinion, appearance, the word dogma. The word dogma means teaching by assertion of beliefs. And that is what we don't want to do in the Theosophical Society, but which we often slip into, teaching by assertion of beliefs. And we get the word dogmatic, assertion without inquiry. I'm sure everybody watching this webinar can think of at least one person, apart from me, who they think is quite dogmatic. And what that really means is that we think they make assertions without inquiry, which also means you can't really talk to them. There's no dialogue, there's no to and fro. So this is what the word dogma means, and this is what we don't have as a part of the platform of the Theosophical Society. But instead of just saying there is no dogma in the Theosophical Society, I think we need to go on and put something in place instead of dogma. Now, what we do also add there is that this is an inquiry-based society. But in that case, I think that we should be spending a certain amount of time in the TS, honing our skills in inquiry, finding out what it really means to inquire. Because inquiry doesn't just stop at throwing questions and answers at a subject matter. It's something far deeper. It goes far deeper than just rational thought. There are lots of things about theosophy that can be said factually without being dogmatic. We know that the word theosophy comes from the Greek theosophia and related to the Sanskrit Brahmavidya. Here are three indisputable, simple facts about theosophy. The word comes from the Greek theosophia, meaning divine wisdom. As a body of thought by that name, it can be traced back to the 3rd century AD, to the eclectic theosophical system of the Alexandrian philosopher Ammonius Saccas, who was the teacher of Plotinus. However, as a concept and as a possibility for the human being, the notion of divine wisdom goes back much further, to the Vedas and the Upanishads, as early as 3000 BC, and most likely as early as 7000 BC. So the word theosophy originally comes to us from Greece, but the concept and the possibility of divine wisdom goes back much further, to at least 3000 BC. Now these are factual statements, not dogmatic assertions, and this is something that we could say in more general terms to inquirers who ask, what is it that you study in the Theosophical Society? What is theosophy? However, unless we have some kind of a definition or understanding of the word divine in the phrase divine wisdom, the previous slide means very little. Now here is a definition of the word divine, which personally I find to be absolutely faultless, doesn't matter which way you slice it up. It comes from a book, Philosophy and Psychology in the Abhidharma by Herbert Gunther. He says, the divine is essentially a symbolic expression of the fact that interest and attention have been drawn away from the surface of sensuous objects and have been directed toward the within, the background and source of all things. The divine is essentially a symbolic expression of the fact that interest and attention have been drawn away from the surface of sensuous objects and have been directed toward the within, the background and surface of all things. Now just take a little bit of time to explain why I think this definition is so faultless, no matter which way you cut it. First of all, he points out something which certainly I often forget, and which I think many people often forget, that words, for example the word divine, is a symbolic expression. The word is not the thing, but even more so, it is a symbolic expression. Now it's easy to remember that when we're looking at a picture or an icon in a church, a picture of Jesus and Mary or something. It's easy to remember that that picture is just a symbolic expression, and we have to give all the meaning to it. There is really nothing behind that stained glass unless we put it there. It's the same with words. There's really nothing behind them unless we put something there. So the divine is a symbolic expression, and what it is an expression of is the fact that interest and attention have been drawn away from the surface of sensuous objects. Now for those who were here for session 1, they might remember that the surface of sensuous objects is what we call Maya, which is in the category of mithya, the falsity of the world, the unreal world, or the world that is a cover over the ultimate reality, real being, pure contentless consciousness. In fact, every word, every symbolic expression is a cover over the real world, which is not of this world, essentially. So it's an expression of the fact that interest and attention have been drawn away from the surface of sensuous objects and directed toward the within. Now what is meant by the word within is also explained here. The within is the background and source of all things. In the TS and in other areas where people do, meditation, yoga, what have you, we hear this expression, look within, very often. And we can be a little unsure, where is that within? What does it mean to look within? Does it mean to psychoanalyze? Does looking within mean looking at my thoughts? Actually, looking within does not mean looking at my thoughts or looking at my history or looking at what my parents did to me or what I did to my parents. It means looking to the background and source of all things, category sat. In the categories of existence, the word divine means looking away from things which are things in the category mithya towards the background and source of all things. So here essentially we also have, elliptically or accidentally, a kind of a definition of what is meant by wisdom as well. We're defining here, or Gunther is defining for us here, what is meant by the word divine. But what about what is meant by the word wisdom? Just as Plato taught that wisdom is an innate capacity of the soul, or the self, it would be in Sanskrit Atman, Plato taught that wisdom is an innate capacity of the self. And the Aryan rishis taught that intelligence and bliss are the innermost essence of what it is to be human being. The innermost essence of being is intelligence and bliss in the Vedas, and in Plato it is wisdom. So we could define the word wisdom in the phrase divine wisdom like this, borrowing from the kind of structure of Gunther's definition here. I would say the word wisdom is a symbolic expression pointing to the intelligence beyond thought that is the very nature of the divine self or Atman. The word wisdom is a symbolic expression which means it's a veil over the real thing. The word wisdom is a symbolic expression pointing to the intelligence beyond thought that is the very nature of the self. So this is not a dictionary definition of wisdom, and neither is Gunther's a dictionary definition of the word wisdom, but it's a meaning definition of the word wisdom. Now, the notion of divine wisdom in the Vedas and in Theosophy is always indissolubly linked with the notion of moksha or liberation. There's no such thing as divine wisdom without divine liberation, because you never attain to the state of divine wisdom without being liberated from the surface of sensuous objects. Liberation is that state where you are fully grounded, you are fully present in the background and source of all things. And not just the background and source of all things outside in the cosmos, but the background and source of all your own thoughts. When you are fully present in the background and source of all your thoughts, you are in a state known as liberation or moksha or nirvana in Buddhism. If we understand that what we are talking about here, if we use the phrase liberation or if we use the phrase divine wisdom, if we understand that what we are talking about here is actually the state of wakefulness, then it will become clearer why these things are all indissolubly connected one with the other. As Roberto Calasso pointed out in his book Ardor, which was recommended to me recently by one of our viewers, this state of wakefulness, of which I'm speaking here and which is throughout the Upanishads and Theosophy, this state of wakefulness is not opposed to sleep. It is opposed to the ordinary state of wakefulness. Last time, I think it was Deborah who asked, what impact would this awareness have on my lower self? It would wake it up. Our lower selves would be more awake in this state. So the state of wakefulness or liberation is not opposed to sleep. It is opposed to the ordinary state of wakefulness, which certainly in my case is inert, inattentive, automatic, and we might add always based on conditioned responses. It's in reactive mode all the time. The more in tune we are with the self, which is divine wisdom, the more our minds will run straight and true and sharp and attentive. So it is in fact the norm to be unawake, but I think it's important not to think of the awakened state as something that is reserved for the elite, some kind of a spiritual elite. Awake is really how we are supposed to be. It may not be the norm for us. The norm for us might be to be relatively inert, inactive, inattentive, and also not very happy, not at peace, and not necessarily very helpful. But that is the norm only for the unawakened. It is not necessarily the norm for human being per se. Now I'd like to just move on and have a look at the same story that we have before us, but looking at it from the subject of occultism briefly. Sometimes Wikipedia ends up yielding quite good definitions, and the definition of occult in Wikipedia is pretty good. And I've taken some of the terms from that definition in this slide. So occult means variously clandestine, hidden, secret, knowledge of the hidden, knowledge of the paranormal, and study of a deeper spiritual reality. These are some of the terms to define occult in Wikipedia, which also describes a number of magical organizations or orders and the teachings and practices taught by them, and also to a large body of current and historical literature and spiritual philosophy related to this subject, which would also of necessity include many of the works of H.P. Blavatsky and other authors in the Theosophical Society, would be classified in this as occult. The word occult and the phrase occult sciences are used by HPB in different ways on different occasions. And in this slide, I have put down some of the words that HPB, some of the sciences which HPB has referred to throughout her works as one of the occult sciences. She has referred to astrology as an occult science, alchemy, ritual magic, magical Kabbalah, tantric worship, and sorcery. Each of these words has appeared in the same sentence of H.P. Blavatsky's, along with the phrase occult sciences. Now we might assume that occultism is the underlying philosophy behind the occult sciences. But curiously, where H.P. Blavatsky uses the term occultism, she goes a lot deeper than that. In the same sentence that you find HPB using the word occultism, she might say Raja Yoga, Atma Vidya. Atma Vidya means self-knowledge, literally, the knowledge of the self. She has also said self-knowledge, which is of loving deeds the child. She sometimes equates altruism with occultism. She equates esotericism with occultism, which in many ways is in fact a synonymous term, not completely, but in many ways. She refers often to theurgy, which is literally translated as divine work, and which we will have something to say about shortly. She has also said that occultism is true wisdom, and I think she would probably agree that the definition on the previous slide would pass for her as both occultism and true wisdom, and of course Theosophia. So for HPB, occultism is equated with Theosophy, whereas the occult sciences are a kind of a lower order of activity and sometimes can end up in sorcery, which is definitely not where you end up on the path of Atma Vidya, altruism, esotericism, theurgy, or true wisdom. I'm skipping that previous slide. And to say a little bit more what we might mean by theurgy, which also what some people in the Theosophical Society might regard as the work, I would like to refer to the first school of theosophy in ancient Greece, or at least the first school which went by that name, the eclectic theosophical system, 3rd century AD. And the photograph there is of Alexander Wilder. I'm not going to take the time to say too much about Alexander Wilder, from whom this outline of the eclectic theosophical system came and made its way into Key to Theosophy and into Isis Unveiled, I think. Alexander Wilder is one of the people who assisted HPB with Isis Unveiled and remained a close colleague of hers until her death. And if you want to read more about Alexander Wilder, you can have a look at a link that I've put recently onto my Facebook page. But meanwhile, let's just have a look at the platform of the eclectic theosophical system, and then in a moment I'm going to compare that to the platform of the Theosophical Society. First of all, belief in one absolute, incomprehensible and supreme deity or infinite essence, which is the root of all nature and of all that is visible and invisible. Belief in one absolute, incomprehensible and supreme deity or infinite essence, which is the root of all nature and of all that is visible and invisible. So we need not think of deity in the ordinary sense perhaps of a personal God. It is the infinite essence, which is the root of all nature, visible and invisible. Then belief in the human being's immortal nature, identical in essence with the universal oversoul. Belief in the human being's immortal nature, identical with the universal oversoul. And theurgy, or divine work, which entails making oneself as pure as the incorporeal beings, so that the gods might impart the divine mysteries. Now this one seems really reads rather archaic, I think, and needs a little bit of unpacking. In the previous slide, it was pointed out that HPB equates occultism with theurgy in some instances. And theurgy is defined here as making oneself as pure as the incorporeal beings, so that the gods might impart the divine mysteries. Now that seems like maybe impossible and very kind of old-fashioned, certainly old-fashioned terminology. But I would like to suggest that inwardly we are incorporeal beings. The self that you really are is an incorporeal being. The self that you really are is an incorporeal being walking around on this earth in several sheaths or covers or vehicles. But essentially, the self is an incorporeal being. And the gods imparting the divine mysteries, the gods don't even need to impart the divine mysteries to the real self, which is of the essence of divine wisdom. I'm ignoring the comments in the chat box because I don't really know what to do with them at this stage, but at the end I'll have a look and try to answer some of those comments. Now this slide is just a comparative shot of the three fundamental tenets of the eclectic theosophical system and the three fundamental propositions of the secret doctrine, which in some ways are an exact match, but which would in some ways be helpful to sort of conflate, because it will help us actually know how to do what is suggested in the third fundamental proposition. So we've just read the eclectic theosophical system, so I'm just going to go through the secret doctrine, and you can see the comparative slide next to it, the comparison next to it. The first fundamental proposition, with which many of us are familiar in our own way: an omnipresent, eternal, boundless and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception and could only be dwarfed by any human expression or similitude. So the proposition there is that there is an eternal, boundless and immutable principle, and that it is impossible to speculate upon it, but which does not mean that it is impossible to do anything with it whatsoever, but it is impossible to speculate or fruitless to speculate about it, since it transcends the power of human conception and could only be dwarfed by any expression or similitude. Then the second fundamental proposition posits the eternity of the universe on the whole as a boundless plane, periodically the playground of numberless universes incessantly manifesting and disappearing. The eternity of the universe as a boundless plane periodically the playground of numberless universes, incessantly manifesting and disappearing. There we have in effect two of the three categories of existence. We have the eternal Sat and the periodical manifestation and disappearance of universes, category Mithya, the temporary world. So there is the eternal world, which is the eternal, which is periodically the playground or the plane on which numberless universes and beings appear and disappear in a cyclic progression, the first model of which comes to us from the Rig Veda. And the third fundamental proposition, which posits the fundamental identity of all souls with the universal oversoul. So here it says that although the eternal, boundless and immutable principle is beyond human conception, it is not actually beyond human identity in a strange sense, because fundamentally all souls or all selves, the Atman, there is only one self, is one with the universal oversoul or Brahman. So although we cannot conceive of this eternal, boundless, pure, contentless consciousness, we can be that, and we are that, except we are not aware of that. So in this slide, as already suggested, I posit an absolute identity between the first expression of this teaching to have arrived on this planet, the Vedic, which says that the self that you really are is the same as Brahman, which is the totality, the unconditioned totality. Then the second expression of this that comes to us, at least in this webinar, and the first by the name of Theosophy, is that of the eclectic Theosophical system, belief in one absolute, incomprehensible and supreme deity or infinite essence, which is the root of all nature, of all that is visible and invisible. And then from about 1880 onwards, we have the same teaching, an omnipresent, eternal, boundless and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible. But while all speculation is impossible, there is still a fundamental identity of all souls or all Atman with the universal oversoul, which is Brahman. In Ammonius's system, belief in the human being's immortal nature, identical in essence with the universal oversoul. Yes, the supreme deity is the same as the universal oversoul, of which we are each a spark. Now, Sri Ram, in his quote earlier on, in the quote that I selected from his work earlier on, said that there are three ways, three roads to theosophy for us in the Theosophical Society. We learn what is theosophy partly from the ancient writings that have come down to us, partly from the writings of H.P. Blavatsky, Annie Besant and others, and partly from our own understanding. And of course, in this field of endeavour, our own understanding is absolutely indispensable, and we're going to be looking at that very closely in session 6. The essential role played by us today in our understanding of theosophy and in the presentation of theosophy in the present time. So, talking about ancient sources, I would like to point out, before getting to this slide actually, there is something quite essential that I forgot to mention at the beginning of this webinar, which I would like to point out now. While we're talking about original sources, and I keep referring to the Vedas, and I've pointed out in the first session of this webinar series that the first expression of many of our sciences is from the Vedas, and I really mean our sciences. You know, it's our astronomy, our mathematics, our medicine, and our astronomy. So it's, and also the first expression of any English language speaker, the root of it is, because English is an Indo-Aryan language, our first text is actually the Rig Veda. So for English speakers, our first philosophy text and how to live life properly text is not the Torah, it's not the, I don't know what, it's not the Tao Te Ching, it is the Vedas. And so much so that the German Sanskritist Friedrich Max Müller once remarked, insofar as we are Aryans in speech and therefore thought, so far the Rig Veda is our own oldest book. Isn't that a cool statement? Insofar as we are Aryans in speech, that is in thought, so far the Rig Veda is our own oldest book, the first development of intellectual activity in our own race. Now I would like to show one more time, before we close for today, how the first expression of Theosophy, as it was given to the world by H.P. Blavatsky, was actually Vedic. Shankaracharya, the lifespan of which 788 to 820, summed up the whole of the teaching of the Upanishads, which is Vedanta, summed up the whole of the Vedanta in 3 pithy little sentences. Brahman alone is real. The world is unreal. Ultimately, there is no difference between Brahman and Jiva. Jiva is the embodied self. So Shankaracharya taught that the whole of the Upanishads, the whole of the Vedanta philosophy or teaching, could be summarized in these 3 sentences. Brahman alone is real. So Brahman, which is the unconditioned totality, category Sat, is alone real. The world is unreal. It is a projection or a Maya of Brahman, category Mithya. I'm referring here to the first session of this webinar. And ultimately, there is no difference between Brahman and Jiva, which is the same as saying, or you can summarize the whole teaching again in one sentence or one phrase, which is Atman is Brahman. Now compare this to the fundamental propositions of the secret doctrine, the first of which is an omnipresent, eternal, boundless and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception and could only be dwarfed by any human expression, i.e. Brahman. The first fundamental proposition of Theosophy or of the secret doctrine is Brahman, that there is Brahman, that Brahman exists. The second, the eternity of the universe, periodically the playground of numberless universes, incessantly manifesting and disappearing, that is the Mayavic world, the level of the world, the falsity of the world in the categories of existence, Sat, Asat and Mithya. The eternity of the universe as a boundless plane, but periodically the playground of numberless universes, and those numberless universes, including the numberless universes of all of my thoughts, are a veil over that which is alone real, which is the Atman in the human being and in the universe Brahman. And finally, the third fundamental proposition, the fundamental identity of all souls with the universal oversoul, which in Shankaracharya was, ultimately, there is no difference between Brahman and Jiva. the fundamental identity of all souls with the universal oversoul. So, I mean, is that not extraordinary that we have H.P. Blavatsky reiterating in 1888 what Shankaracharya iterated when he was actually quite young, so not far off 788. So that's like 1,000 years before. And prior to that, the same teaching was iterated in the Rig Veda. So now to close, a very interesting quote I find from an arch materialist, Sir Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the DNA helix, where he says, I've called this "What a Difference a Worldview Makes." He says, I myself, like many scientists, believe that the soul is imaginary and that what we call our mind is simply a way of talking about the function of our brains. Once one has become adjusted to the ideas that we are here because we have evolved from simple chemical compounds by a process of natural selection, it is remarkable how many of the problems of the modern world take on a completely new light. I myself, like many scientists, believe that the soul is imaginary. Well, according to Shankaracharya, the soul or the self is the only thing in your experience that is not imaginary. All of your thoughts are imaginary, your feelings are imaginary, your opinions are imaginary, but the self behind all of those imaginary things is not imaginary. It was not created by the mind of man. And it is in fact amazing what a difference a worldview makes. It is remarkable how many of the problems of the modern world would take on a completely new light in view of the fundamental proposition that the ultimate reality is pure contentless consciousness, periodically the playground of numberless universes, and similarly for each and every single one of us, the ultimate reality is pure contentless consciousness, periodically the playground of numberless thoughts. And what we do about those numberless thoughts and what is behind those numberless thoughts, we're going to be looking at far more closely in session 4 next week of this webinar. Yes, the observer is the only not illusion. The observer is the only not illusion. But the observer is not, let me put it this way. In the sentence, I am Dara Tatray, everything after the first two words, I am, is part of the illusion. You know, Dara Tatray is the name, form, function, body-mind complex. The I am is the observer. And if we want to liberate ourselves from the category illusion, the only way of doing that is to find out for ourselves, is to discern in ourselves that level of consciousness which is the observer and which is indeed the only thing in the world that is not illusion. Yes, Deborah's saying, hope this isn't too silly. Does this mean Brahman? Does this mean Brahman is a soul? Well, I'm not absolutely sure what is meant there, but in Shankaracharya's teachings in the Upanishads, there is no essential difference between the innermost essence of the universe, which is Brahman, and the innermost essence, the most subtle essence of human consciousness, which is the Atman. I'm just going to scroll up in this chat box. Is divine an adjective or a noun? That's an interesting point. That's a very interesting point, Ed. Is divine an adjective or a noun? It is a noun. I think we use the word divine and many other words as though they were adjectives, which are like descriptions and kind of flowery language. Like we use the word divine, and maybe in our minds, without realizing it, we've got something like very, very nice, very good, really great, and that they're all adjectives. Divine is not an adjective. I suppose sometimes it's used that way, but in the phrase divine wisdom, it is a noun. It is a noun a noun is a word that describes an actual thing. And divine is an actual no thing, but let's just say category thing, no thing, category thing. So yes, it is a noun. And like all nouns, they need to be located. All nouns are located somewhere, aren't they? And I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but if you've got a recipe for making cookies and it says it includes, butter, flour, eggs, and milk, you need to go to the pantry and the fridge and actually locate the butter, flour, eggs, and milk. And you can locate them because they really exist. They're nouns. The divine and theosophy are also nouns, but they are nouns in the order of being, which is the omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and immutable principle, which can't be located sensorily. They're nouns, but they are not thing nouns. They are, can I get out of this? Yes, sorry about that. I just want to go back to see in what sense is divine as noun. The divine is a noun, but it is among the nouns that exist away from the surface of sensuous objects. It is a non-sensuous noun. I think that's an important point, Ed. The divine is a non-sensuous noun. We may have created for the first time in history a new category in linguistics, non-sensuous nouns, and that includes the divine. Just flicking up here. Well, dogma in Ed's dictionary means a principle or set of principles laid down by authorities as incontrovertibly true. Yes, in some ways. It's a system of taught beliefs. It's an assertion of beliefs as incontrovertibly true. But definitely all of these meanings in the word dogma didn't come from my imagination. They actually do derive from the root meaning of the word dogma, from the Greek doxa and the Latin docere. And in session 6, we're going to see what is the alternative to dogma. In Plato's teachings, belief, opinion, appearance, doxa, is the category where science is. Real knowing and understanding is something else altogether. It doesn't come from the word dogma at all. So there's quite a big difference in Plato's teachings between dogma, belief, opinion, and appearance, and wisdom, knowing, understanding. And people find it a bit strange that Plato would put science under the line as not knowledge. Plato regarded science as not knowledge with a capital K, and the reason for that is that science is to do with the phenomenal world, the world of sensory objects, and wisdom is found when interest and attention is drawn away from the surface of sensuous objects.